Hi, folks. Welcome back to the FITSNews studio, another edition of your Week in Review. I am Will Folks, the founding editor, owner of FITSNews.com. A big show, a big week ahead. We're starting with the Rose Petal murder. This trial set to gavel on Monday in Greenville, South Carolina. Jen Wood and Dylan Nolan will be there. We're going to bring you the latest on that story, including some seismic allegations from one of the key players in those proceedings. Jen and I are also going to sit down to update you on another upstate murder, the saga of 20-year-old Jessica Barnes. We're going to hear a chilling excerpt from the man accused of murdering her. Last but not least, Dylan Nolan and I are going to discuss the latest Palmetto political news, and I'm laughing a little bit because, folks, Thomas Ravenel, a blast from the past, has announced his candidacy for governor of the Palmetto State. If you thought this cycle was crazy, it just got crazier. We're also going to discuss how Ravenel's entry could impact the dynamics of this race and some key positions that are already being staked out by some of the candidates who have already spoken to FITSNews about their intentions. All that and more is coming your way on the Week in Review. So we're kicking off this week's episode with the trial that wasn't. The Rose Petal murder, a case out of Greenville County, South Carolina that just confounds comprehension. It is one of the most graphic, most bizarre, unexplained stories we've ever covered. So many twists and turns in this one, folks. And we were supposed to cover a trial in this case last month. In fact, if you're a regular viewer of the Week in Review, we devoted an entire episode of the show last month to this story. Trial didn't happen. Apparently, jurors that were summoned, only about a third of them showed up. They were unable to seat a jury. Now, the trial is scheduled to start this coming week, and I am joined now by the two people on the FITSNews staff who will be covering this trial from start to finish. Our Jen Wood, Research Director, Dylan Nolan, Special Projects Director. So you guys are getting read into this case. Jen, you've been pretty read into this case, but Dylan, you've been getting read into it over the past week, getting ready for this trial. Let's walk people through it because this is such an incredibly complicated case, but there are really four main figures. And Jen, I want to start with you just to give people kind of the overview of the Rose Petal case. Who are the key figures here that we should be paying attention to as this trial is scheduled to start in Greenville next week?
Okay, the victim is Christina Parcell. The crime occurred in Greer, October 13th, 2021. So she was found by her fiance, Bradley Post, at just after 11 a.m. in the morning. She hadn't been answering her phone. Post was concerned and went to the home that she was living in. It was owned by her sister, Lutina Parcell, and that is when he discovered her body. It was an extremely brutal murder. She was stabbed 31 times in the head and neck area. Sources have told us that the crime scene was staged with rose petals or dead head roses around her. So, just very bizarre circumstances going into it. Bradley Post, her fiance, looking at police reports at the time from the murder, initially exhibited some very bizarre behavior, asking first responders if he should contact a lawyer before talking to them, putting on rubber gloves before entering the house with them. And he was arrested shortly after her murder.
And everyone thought he was going to be arrested as the murderer. I remember
right.
this happened.
Everybody thought Bradley Post was going to be the suspect. But when they announced the charges, it was related to child pornographic materials that were found in the course of the investigation. In fact, a lot of it.
Yeah, like 50,000 different files, we're told.
Right. So he was arrested. He is his multitude of charges relating to that are pending. The Attorney General is taking the lead in prosecuting that. Last time I checked with them in December, there had not been any motions filed. There no new news on that. Then shortly after Bradley Post was arrested, the father of Christina's young child was arrested for child custodial interference.
This individual, we're going to talk a lot about him on the show today. His name is John Mello, a music producer, frequent visitor to Italy, global traveler, very well-connected individual. We're going to talk a lot about him on this show, but Jen, go back to those charges against him.
Right. So once again, he's arrested. Everybody, starts thinking, oh, maybe he did it.
Nope.
But no, no, he was arrested for child custodial interference related to him taking their shared daughter to Italy, allegedly without Christina's consent, withholding her visitation. Um, so there was an ongoing and very contentious custody battle between Christina Parcell and John Mello over this child. And we'll get into that a little more. But the fourth person who was ultimately arrested for this in November of 2021 was at the time 29-year-old Zachary Hughes, a classically trained concert pianist with no apparent ties to Christina Parcell. And that is whose trial is happening next week.
Yeah, it's his murder trial is what we're covering.
Right.
And you talked, Jen, about how everyone was kind of expecting when those first two arrest announcements were made, those seemed like, okay, well, that would make sense if those were tied to this murder, but they weren't. When Zach Hughes was arrested, this was like a bolt from the blue. Like you said, here's a classically trained pianist, a guy well known around the upstate for his Beethoven sonatas, concertos, playing these incredibly complex pieces. So this guy came out of nowhere, and as you mentioned, no known connection to the victim. Walk us through, though, how we began to sort of piece together how some of these four characters fit, Jen.
Right. So as the prosecution and police began to release more information, we learned that the only known connection with Christina Parcell and Zachary Hughes is the father of the young child, John Mello. And in the course of the investigation, they had Zachary Hughes's phone, eventually got it unlocked and found a number of messages on the application WhatsApp between the two, including messages. Well, John Mello was in Italy because when they arrested him for the child custodial charges in November, he was returning from Italy. Messages to Hughes to harass the shit out of Christina Parcell. And then on the day of the murder, a message that asked Hughes, how did the music research go? And Hughes responded to Mello, good, I'll tell you over the phone, which prosecutors have implied that could be coded messaging related to the murder.
Well, and also let's be clear, these two were jointly arrested in the fall of 2023 and charged with harassment and conspiracy by the SC 13th Circuit Solicitor's Office, Walt Wilkins' office. He is the prosecutor leading the murder case this coming week against Zach Hughes. But I want to bring Dylan in because obviously we've laid a lot of this out for our audience, and certainly there are connections between Hughes and Mello that raise questions. But Dylan, I want to bring you in. You've had the opportunity in recent days to speak to John Mello, and we have all been on the receiving end of many missives from Mello and his supporters. He has quite a few of them. And Dylan, I wanted to bring you in to speak a little bit to this side of the story because before we get into what Mr. Mello thinks happens here, he was absolutely correct when he alleged that his daughter was being abused. And in fact, I spoke with his lawyer recently, and he made the point that Mello was actually being forced to take his daughter and drop her off and leave her in a situation where he knew she was being abused, and no one was doing anything about it, according to his attorney, Mo Abusoft, up there in Spartanburg. But Dylan, you spoke directly to John Mello. What's your measure of the man?
John, obviously, when you communicate with him, he's very passionate, very hot blooded. He's the kind of person who, you might receive a couple of messages in all caps. That being said, I don't know that he's wrong on the facts in this case. In all instances, it's one of these situations where I can understand. Like, John has brought to me facts that I can't say are wrong. I can see how he could have brought these, though, to a state official, somebody at DSS, say, who might have said, okay, this guy seems like he's a little bit unhinged in the way that he's presenting this information, and not taking it as seriously. That being said, he alleged that his daughter was in an abusive, unsafe household years prior to this murder. And it took the homicide for that information to become public record.
Yeah, you're right. And in fact, his lawyer, I mentioned Mo earlier from Spartanburg, Mo made the point that were Christina Parcell alive today, she would be in jail based on these charges, or based on the evidence that was found at
Or
the
would they
crime
have
scene.
never actually discovered it?
Good.
Would she
Yeah,
still be producing this material today?
that's
Would
true.
this child still be in that situation?
Would his daughter still be in that house?
Right. And the custodial interference charge against him was ultimately dropped.
Yeah, that's true. Mello did at the time that custodial interference charge was leveled against him. He called it out, said he was innocent, and sure enough, Judge Barry Gravely, up there in the 13th Circuit, issued a directed verdict in Mello's favor against Walt Wilkins' office, validating Mello's take on that issue.
And it's
anyway.
very
But,
interesting what happened at that
Dylan,
trial. Sorry to interrupt you, Will, but Mello's daughter actually took the stand. The prosecution's first question was something to the effect of, did your father take you to Italy? Which she answered, paraphrasing here, yes, and it was the best time of my life.
mhm.
So not only did, she obviously said what the prosecution was saying is true. Mello took her to Italy. But the reason that the judge threw this case out, and if you follow trials, you know that every time the defense is going to make a motion for a directed verdict, but very rarely are these motions granted. So this is an exceptional circumstance, and one in which the state clearly was completely backwards in bringing this charge. I mean, the judge would not have thrown it out in that way unless he felt strongly in that.
Now, Mello has made a series of allegations in the run up to this trial. He has, in court filings, in fact, accused Christina Parcell's sister. We mentioned her earlier, Lutina Parcell. She goes by Tina, but he's accused Tina Parcell of some of the same behavior that Christina Parcell was accused of committing as it related to his daughter. And in fact, there was a court filing. Dylan, you were able to obtain it. We've been able to verify that information. You've got a story on FITSNews about it related to this allegation. Dylan, were we able to investigate that claim any further and see if there were any merit to what Mello claimed that Lutina Parcell did?
Yes, so we've obtained this court filing, which has an affidavit signed by a licensed mental counselor who was seeing his minor child, the same minor child who was abused by Christina, who alleged to this counselor, to John, that Lutina Parcell, Christina's sister, had taken a photograph of her while she was getting changed after she exited the shower. Now, we've also contacted Lutina, who was never charged in connection with this incident. She has provided us documents from the Greenville County Sheriff's Office indicating that they didn't, have evidence there to bring criminal charges. But this is certainly something that the daughter alleged, that was brought to the attention of DSS, and that Lutina denies herself.
Right. And there were also apparently some forensic court, not ordered, but the court suggested that Lutina Parcell turn over all of her electronic devices for a forensic review. She did that. The findings of that investigation, per her account, are that there was no evidence of any attempt to delete files or anything of that nature. So,
and I'm not accusing her of doing anything wrong here, but I also don't think that this is a comprehensive review because it costs so much money to conduct this review that they couldn't go through all of her electronics. So you're looking at only an analysis of her cell phone, which she voluntarily brought to these people and turned in. Now, I mean, how much of an idiot would you have to be to turn in a device that you knew had something inappropriate on it? It's not like the cops came, bolt out of the blue one day, showed up and took her devices. She brought this and drove
correct.
it to
That's
that
true.
examiner. Now, presumably, they would be able to detect if there was evidence on there that was deleted, but also this is not an airtight process. As if the feds swoop in one day, you have no clue, and they come and take everything in your house.
That's absolutely true. And in fact, that's one of the reasons when we interviewed her, we got her on the record and said, "Hey, are you sure you took all of your devices to this review?" She stated she did. So anyway, if she's on the record one way or the other, and obviously John Mello's claims against her on the record, but Dylan, Mello has thrown a lot more out there in this case, and several of his supporters who are about as all caps and vigorous on the emails and texts and direct message and social communications as he is, they've thrown some theories out there. One of them I want to ask you about is this. I don't know if I want to call it a conspiracy theory or what, because again, we've seen nothing at this point to substantiate it. But the theory that Zach Hughes is being framed, one of Mello's supporters has told us directly that the Greenville County Police Department is framing Zach Hughes, that the DNA evidence against him is fabricated, that this murder was in fact committed by a police officer who was being blackmailed by the victim, in this case, Christina Parcell. Not only that, one of Hughes's allies has alleged that other media outlets have been provided with other footage from the day of the murders, which exonerate Hughes and which in fact show the assailant, the murderer in this case, as someone who knew Parcell. And I don't want to get too into the details. Again, Dylan, it was your conversation with some of these sources, but Dylan, this theory that the police killed Christina Parcell and covered it up, what do you say to that? What do you think is there any basis to that theory?
Well, you're exactly right in saying that this is not something that has been documented. The difficult thing about dealing with a situation like this is that really the department which the officer who is alleged to have done this works for is the department which investigated this case. So unless you see the involvement of federal authorities, unless the state law enforcement division involves itself, who exactly does one expect to publish this information unless somebody like John or another concerned private party goes and hires PIs, which costs a significant amount of money to try to dig this information up on their own? How are we really going to see this information uprooted? You know, it's a complex situation where the incentives, obviously, if there is corruption within a police force, is to hide that corruption. And I should point out that South Carolina has repeatedly seen law enforcement officials do unethical things. So it's not like this is completely off the table.
Well, I would argue it's not completely off the table, but at this point, I mean, we're talking about ethical standards of an officer. And so far, all we have to go on to accuse him of impropriety is
the word of John Mello.
And again, I think here's the catch-22 in this case. Mello was right about the abuse of his daughter. He was right. No one believed him. No one listened to him, but he was right. And so again, it's almost, hey, you got a little credibility in the bank. Let's roll the dice again. But we will see. Mello's attorneys, I've spoken with them extensively. They are defending him aggressively on those harassment charges that I mentioned earlier. They claim that he only disseminated images that Christina Parcell had already put in the public domain herself, that she was in fact profiting from sex images online. So they say, how can he harass her with these images if she had already put them out into the marketplace? But Dylan, this is just a crazy case. Jen, I want to ask you about this as we move into what to expect next week. There's a big development that not a lot of folks have been talking about regarding this case, because initially we were led to believe that the solicitor's office in Greenville, Walt Wilkins' office, would be essentially trying John Mello as an unindicted co-conspirator, and that he would factor very prominently in this upcoming court case. That is not what's happening, though, is it, Jen?
It doesn't appear to be. That is, that's another point. In addition to John being right about his daughter, John has never been charged in connection with this murder. Also, we have heard that he has not been subpoenaed in relation to this trial. He has not been put on notice that he's going to be a witness, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah, I absolutely would expect him to be front and center in this trial. I mean, he's obviously one of the four, as you mentioned, Jen, core people in this case. What does that tell you, Jen, that he's not on that witness list?
You know what? It could mean a number of things, just like with the Murdaugh trial with Cousin Eddie, we kept thinking he was on the witness list. We kept thinking he was going to get called, but he wasn't. Are they choosing to not call him because he's an unpredictable?
John is a lot like Cousin Eddie, though. I think both present, potential damage to both parties. If you think about it from the perspective of the state, John obviously hates the prosecutors who have tried to put him in prison for a charge that was thrown out by a judge. And then you have his theories about, law enforcement acting completely improprietously here, which he would probably find a way to get in front of that jury. Okay, now let's take it, if the defense calls him, the state's going to cross him and start getting into these conversations, which they have documents of between him and Zach. And I think that if you're the defense, you are obviously worried that the state's going to use this as an opportunity to show motive. But yes, if both of these, if they are going to be bringing John up as far as the state's theory of why Zach, a guy who without John has no motive to kill Christina Parcell, would throw his life away, it's interesting that they're not calling him.
Right. I also want to point out that in my conversation with Mello's attorney, he did explicitly state that the more that the solicitor's office and investigators with the Greenville County Sheriff's Department, the more they got into that cell phone and the more evidence they uncovered. He said clearly they did not find evidence of a conspiracy to murder, or else Mello would have been charged, which is a fair point also, Dylan.
Yes, and we don't know. I mean, the state could intend to charge him directly after this trial, but it's certainly strange that they have not chosen to charge him to this point if they really do believe that he was involved in a conspiracy to facilitate the murder of Christina Parcell.
Right. Well, again, I felt almost it was like listening to the OJ trial all over again when I was reading some of these motions. You see the preemptive effort by the defense attorneys to shut down some of the prosecutorial avenues, and the DNA is going to be key in this case because, like the OJ case, there is damning DNA evidence here. We're talking about Zach Hughes' DNA under the fingernails of the victim, Christina Parcell. That is tough to get around, but
it's interesting, though. I've heard from multiple different, defense side sources who are unrelated to one another that the defense feels confident that they can beat this DNA evidence.
Well, OJ sure as hell beat it, so we'll see
Anything's
if
possible.
Zach Hughes is that fortunate. Hughes, by the way, has been incarcerated since November of 2021. This trial was originally scheduled to take place last year. It was delayed till January. Again, as we mentioned at the outset, delayed in January due to the juror issue. Now, they have issued a summons for a much broader juror pool this time, so we are hopeful that enough of those Greenville citizens show up that we will be able to draw a jury. But Jen Wood, you and Dylan are heading up to Greenville on Monday to cover this saga from the very start as the murder trial of Zach Hughes begins in Greenville. Clearly, a lot of angles to this case. And once again, I would reiterate our invitation to John Mello to sit down with us and share on the record his side of this story as we approach this trial. But Jen, Dylan, amazing work on this and looking forward to y'all's coverage of this next week.
Thanks, Will.
So another big story that we've been focused on over the past few months is also out of the Palmetto Upstate. It is the story of the murder of Jessica Barnes, a 20-year-old from Pendleton, South Carolina, whose family reported her missing in mid-September. She had not been seen since early August of 2024. Well, in early October, 2 months after her disappearance, her body was found by a boat ramp in Pickens County, South Carolina. Now, 3 individuals have been charged in connection with her murder. One of them, Brandon Barnes, is accused of strangling her to death. His 2 accomplices, Victoria Tippett and Kendall Mims, were accused of helping him dispose of the body and lying to police about its whereabouts. Now, this case has a lot of different threads, a lot of different components to the narrative, but one of the things that I've found incredibly interesting about it is that we have a direct interview with the accused murderer. Now, this rarely happens. In South Carolina, obviously, a lot of murderers, you don't know who they are until the murder's taken place and they're in jail. And obviously, once an inmate in South Carolina is sentenced, they're not allowed to give interviews per state law as enforced by the Department of Corrections. So to actually hear an accused murderer on tape talking about their case, it's a rarity. But in this case, due to our relationship with an up-and-coming media outlet in the upstate, Blunt Force Media, and its leader, Troy Stiles, we have been fortunate enough to get tape of Brandon Barnes discussing the relationship he had with his late wife prior to the arrest. Now, it's important to point out in this interview, Jessica Barnes was still missing. At the time that this interview took place, her body had not been found. No arrests had been made in connection with either her disappearance or her murder. Everyone at that point assumed Brandon Barnes was a forlorn husband seeking to find his wife. In fact, When Troy Stiles encountered him, he was putting missing posters up on the town square in Pendleton, South Carolina. And I'm joined now by Jen Wood, our research director. Jen, you and Troy have formed a bond as you've covered this story, going over these tapes, listening to Brandon Barnes. First of all, tell us, how did you and Troy get connected on this story, Jen?
We connected. This story is actually what connected us. When I saw that Jessica was missing, I had reached out to her mother, Cecilia, just to, I planned on covering it and wanted to speak with her about it, get some information for my story. And she said she had, spoken to Troy as well. I had heard of Troy, but, hadn't really spoken to him. So after I spoke with Cecilia, who, is just a lovely woman, I connected with Troy, and he had, through the course of this, gotten very, very close to Jessica's family. He was helping them with posters and, kind of stepped in and helped them navigate the media as the case became more high profile. It became very overwhelming for her family.
Yeah, he wears a lot of hats, doesn't he? He's like a victims advocate, media relations professional, and his own media outlet. He wears a lot of different hats, doesn't he?
He does, yeah. And he, his outlet focuses on, true crime. And he does, as part of that role, he doesn't get paid for it, but steps in and helps victims and their families communicate with the press and to, make sure that updates are happening, make sure the family's connecting with police for updates. So it's a really interesting role. So he was downtown Pendleton hanging these flyers up all day long and kind of stumbled into Brandon Barnes, and, like anybody, took the opportunity to, say, hey, do you want to talk to me about your wife who's missing? So I think it was fascinating. He's very, if when you see the interview, you'll understand. But he's very approachable, very friendly, very compassionate, and I think connected with Brandon very quickly and gained his trust. In their initial interview, it was just Brandon and Victoria Tippett, and then the next night they agreed to a second conversation, and that one was Brandon, Victoria, and Kendall Mims, the other alleged co-conspirator.
Well, you've got some tape here. I want to cut to this first excerpt, Jen, is from literally the first moments when he turned that recorder on. As you mentioned, he took a while building that rapport with Brandon Barnes, setting ground rules, letting him know that, he could trust him. And when they did start that recorder rolling, though, he asked a question right out of the gate. What would you say to your missing wife? And Jen, this is some chilling tape. Let's roll it.
But if there was something that you wanted to say to Jessica, if she could hear your message, what would you say to her?
I tell her how much I love her. I wish I never went to work every day and ignored her. Ignored her voice. Told her she was fine when I knew she wasn't. Her mental breakdowns, I should have seen that she was not okay, and I ignored them. The fact I never actually just took time to sit down and ask her, hey, are you okay? Never did. I was young and stupid. I was always focused on getting more money, more work, focused on maybe if I made music, maybe I'd get better financially. I know me and her never had the childhood we wanted. We struggled a lot. We always relied on a lot of people. We never felt like we had hope in life. We always felt down, depressed, miserable, alone, seeking for help, hiding from help, never accepting it when it came. Childhood trauma, being abused as a kid, blaming people for it. Many things we regret we have done. She always told me she wanted me to stop cheating and stop going out at night at wrong times, never coming home. So I took time to actually sit down and talk to her. After I read that note, it hurt so much.
Jen, that is just chilling to listen to.
It's difficult, especially knowing, just a week later, they arrested him and charged him with her murder. The things that he tries to, say he wants to tell her definitely pointed to, they were very young and very, very contentious relationship, very up and down. There was a lot of things going on at the time Jessica disappeared. And, it just made me sad hearing what he, and then he goes on to read this letter that he found, he said, in Jessica's Bible, that was written July 4th. She was murdered, according to police, on August 2nd. So just, less than a month before her murder, she wrote a letter to Brandon and put it in her Bible, and he found it. And it's just sad, you hear Jessica's hopes and dreams, and she talks about their struggles and their relationship. Troy noted when he showed up, he initially met him, and Brandon said he was going to go home and, come back and meet with him that night. And he showed up with the ashes of their baby at the town square. Like, he brings the ashes with him. I mean, just bizarre stuff. But yeah, it was sad listening to that letter.
And this is the baby that they lost. And in fact, there's allegations related to him and her losing that baby. We won't get into those now, but those are probably going to come out at the trial. But just to set a little bit of the stage here, Brandon Barnes, married to Jessica Barnes. He's 21, she's 20. They are living in a pool house with two other women, one of whom he impregnated and has a baby with. Another relationship not entirely determined. But Jen, this is just a graphic murder. We have a strangulation death, according to police. We have allegations of dismemberment after death. We have transporting these body parts to this remote location, burning them, burying them. Hey, this is just a horrific crime, Jen. And you hear this guy on the tape, and he's, sounds like the love lost husband.
Yeah, I mean, at one point, the next clip that we're going to throw to, he just starts crying, talking about what he could have done better, and it was hard to listen to now.
Let's cut to that clip of Brandon Barnes getting emotional in his interview with Troy Stiles. Let's take a listen.
Well, I always wanted a life with Jessica. I wanted it just to be me and her, but I was always broke. I didn't have no money. Couldn't afford a house. I didn't have good credit. I just wish I could have gave her the world. Her missing is just really traumatizing me.
Jen, it's interesting. We were talking to Dylan Nolan before the show, and he was looking at some of the comments on this and how folks were noting the similarities between Brandon Barnes and Susan Smith, the notorious child killer who Dylan covered her parole hearing the other day, and she turned the tears on at that hearing, just like she turned the tears on decades ago when she falsely accused a black man of kidnapping her two children, which she was the one who killed them. But do you see that similarity too? That is that sort of sociopathic 101 type behavior here?
Yeah, I drew that parallel even initially when we were listening to it right after Troy interviewed him. We had this for quite some time, and Troy had turned it over to investigators to listen to. And we waited for them to give us the thumbs up before releasing any of it, just to make sure it wasn't evidence that was going to be used in the prosecution. But, even back in September when I was listening to it, that's the first thing I thought. I was like, this just doesn't sound sincere to me.
Yeah. Now, we've heard a lot from the family of one of the accused in this case. And so I do want to ask you this. We do hear some giggling on some of these tapes as these girls are talking about different things. Jen, you hear that giggling. What does that say to you?
So yeah, the second recording that we are releasing, all three are there. And it was bizarre hearing the giggling, but Troy did note, even during that interview, he was seeing that the signs of control that Brandon had over both of those girls. The girls would drive in separate cars and follow him everywhere. He seemed to have control over Kendall's phone during the interview. It was very bizarre. So it's hard to really understand the mindset that they were in at that point in time, because you've got to remember that this was before they were arrested. Everything had started heating up. They had taken off for Colorado for 3 days and then just came back and were arrested a week later. So I don't know if it was just nervous giggling, if it was I get the church giggles. If it was giggling at inappropriate times, if it was just inappropriate giggling, you really don't know.
Well, we'll be diving into a lot of that in the next installment of these tapes. Troy has agreed to provide those exclusively to FITSNews for our next installment of this. And Jen, just can't thank Troy enough and the work he's doing. Again, he wears a lot of hats, plays a lot of different roles, but in addition to victims advocate, media outlet himself, PR liaison with victims' families and the media, he's also incredibly helpful, obviously, to members of the media. So we're super grateful for his assistance in our coverage of this case. Jen, real quick, what's next on the agenda in this case? Obviously, there was an initial hearing a few weeks back that you covered where bond was denied for one of the accused in this case, but there's a big hearing coming up later this month. Tell us what to expect next in this case, Jen.
Right. So all three of them, Brandon, Kendall, and Victoria, will have their preliminary hearings on February 14th in the morning. So that will, I think that will give us, we did see a little bit of the prosecution's case at Kendall's bond hearing, but the preliminary hearing is where, they're going to present a little bit of the evidence to show that they have enough to prosecute. So we should learn a little more about what they have. Like you said, the alleged crime, the crime, because we know she's dead, was horrific. When you said body, it really was just remains, because they allegedly burned her to where they had to use odontologists to identify her teeth. There was that little left. And in the next recording, when we release it, viewers will hear them talking about when the police came with a search warrant and searched that pool house, and the luminol, and how the luminol lit up the entire pool house. So, I
And that's
wonder
what they
if
test for blood.
Right.
Oh, wow.
In the car as well, which, presumably if they did this, would have transported her body in. So we will hear that. I wonder, how far they're going to get into that during preliminary hearings, but it will be the first time we've seen Brandon since he was arrested. It will be interesting.
Just a shocking case, Jen, and you, Troy, do an amazing work on it, bringing this information. Folks, if you came to FITSNews for the Murdochs, or if you've been following the Rose Petal case, the crazy story we were talking about earlier, keep up on this one. It is just a shocking story, and it's one that we still don't know all the answers to, and we're digging on those as this case moves forward. Again, the disappearance and murder of 20-year-old Jessica Barnes, Pendleton, South Carolina, a story FITSNews has been on from the very beginning. We will continue to bring you the latest on that story. Thank you so much, Jen, for your work on this one.
Thanks, Will.
So several of our segments over the last few months have focused on the sniping between the two frontrunners in the South Carolina governor's race. Nancy Mace, 1st District Congresswoman, has been throwing bombs against Attorney General Alan Wilson, literally lighting him up by the minute on social media. But that battle took a back seat this week as a blast from the past announced his intention to run for governor. In fact, not his intention, he said he's running. Thomas Ravenel, former state treasurer for a few minutes, turned reality TV star, two-time U.S. Senate candidate, a name known all across the country from his Bravo TV stardom. But Dylan, this guy's got some credible ideas. In fact, we're going to talk in a minute how he's speaking from the same sheet of music, singing from the same sheet of music as some of the other candidates we've talked to.
He is. He's got some credible ideas. He also has a criminal history, having You mentioned he's had a short stint in the state treasurer's office. That was obviously ended by federal drug charges he eventually pled guilty to and served time in the federal penitentiary. It's our understanding that this is the the first race that he's eligible for after that probationary period ended after those charges.
Yeah, Dylan, it's interesting. Actually, he ran federally. He could run federally and then finished third in a race to Lindsey Graham back in 2014. But the state law prohibits him from running for a 15-year period. Now, the dates on this, we're going to have to go back and look at the time of his plea, when he left prison, what exactly the wording is. But obviously, Ravenel making it clear he is in. So he's also the second blast from the past in this race. We reported back in November that former Governor Mark Sanford, who served 2 terms from 2003 to 2011, is also thinking about running. And just this week, we had confirmation of that, multiple outlets up in Washington, D.C., citing sources close to Sanford saying that he's going to run. Now, again, there were questions about his eligibility because the state constitution limits candidates to serving 2 successive terms. But the argument we're hearing is that word successive matters. You can serve the successive terms, and then you're eligible to run again in a non-successive term. Dylan, we got like recycled candidates here, though.
And it's interesting. You've worked with both of these guys, both of these blasts from South Carolina's past.
Responsible for them in a lot of ways.
I didn't put that on you. You put that on yourself. But I do see a lot of people just like, can South Carolina not dig up some new candidates? And you know what? You got to give it to these guys. They're going to not count themselves out of the race. But it does make you wonder, is this really the top political talent we've got here?
Yeah, and Sanford also, like Thomas Ravenel, no stranger to political races since his gubernatorial stint. He was actually elected to the U.S. Congress, served 3 terms after Tim Scott took the U.S. Senate seat, ran very unsuccessfully for president against Donald Trump back in 2020. In fact, I believe had one reporter show up to his announcement outside of Independence Hall in Pennsylvania, showing just how far Sanford's star appeal has fallen. But Dylan, this is a guy who was a legitimate presidential contender back when he was governor of South Carolina. This was a guy that was being positioned to run against Barack Obama in 2012, had a ton of support, kind of blew it all away with his Appalachian Trail sex scandal. And T-Rav, obviously a checkered past, but I guess, is this the best South Carolina can do?
You know, we've had some folks in our studio this week who I think would argue that South Carolina can do better.
Yeah, and let's talk about some of those because we've got a bunch of clips to cut to talking about the big issue that Thomas Ravenel seized on. In fact, when he announced, he talked about there's been a lack of leadership from South Carolina's executive branch on the issue of taxes and that our tax system is non-competitive, punitive, in fact, and that if he's running, which now he has said he is running, he's going to fight to change that. Every candidate this year is running on taxes, Dylan. I want to start with Sean Bennett. He came into our studio. He was the first candidate that we interviewed. He's a guy who's been on this issue from the beginning, but we got a clip of him here talking about his tax proposals. Let's take a listen.
I mean, the system is broken. So as evidence that it's broken, if you go back, if you look, you don't have to turn on ETV more than 2 or 3 days and watch the sessions, either the House or the Senate, anytime we're in session, and you will see evidence of its brokenness because there will be, without a doubt, at some point, a debate over a tax credit, a carve out, some sort of new tax policy being debated on the fringe. And that's because whoever introduced that carve out has recognized that somebody somewhere is getting hurt by the current tax policy. And we pass those because everybody in the chambers recognize that, yes, that person's getting hurt, so let's fix that person. And every time we pass that, we further erode the tax base. So everybody in the General Assembly recognizes that our tax code is broken. And every time we meet, we further break it. So where do I stand? I don't necessarily agree that we take it to zero. I'm more of a diversified tax approach. I think it's easy, that shiny lure out there that we've kind of grasped at several times just in the past few years with these largest tax breaks in the history of South Carolina. I got in trouble a couple of sessions ago when I stood on the Senate floor when the House passed a tax cut. And I told them that our colleagues said, as we were getting ready to vote, I said, hey, guys, we're getting ready to vote. And we're getting ready to take the highest tax rate in the Southeast, and we're going to take it from the highest rate in the Southeast to the highest tax rate in the Southeast, right? We weren't moving it
Sort of like
one bit.
master's budget, 6.2 to 6. It's
Right.
still,
It's still the highest.
Yeah.
So my point to all those things are, these shiny lures is, hey, we're cutting this tax, but we're not doing anything effectively. So what I would rather see us do is really take a bite out of these things and lower all of our taxes, right? So if we take one tax down, what we ultimately do is we inflate another one, right? Mm-hmm. It's like squeezing a balloon. So what I'd rather
talking
say
about revenue neutrality.
That's right. So let's just lower taxes, mm-hmm. right? Don't drop a tax rate to zero and then surprise somebody and raise their sales taxes somewhere else or their property tax. Let's widen the tax base. Let's have everybody share in that. So I think that we can come up with a plan where we lower our income tax, to maybe 2.5% or 3%, but let's have everybody pay some of that, right? Mm-hmm. Right now, we've got 42% of the people that are not paying anything at all.
So Senator Sean Bennett is saying something that I've heard a lot of legislators talk about, which is broadening the tax base. Now, he's not one of these guys who's pushing to completely take the top marginal rate down to zero to take us in a place like Tennessee, but you certainly are hearing from all these legislators, these guys who are in the room this legislative session, that they want to bring the rates down. This is similar to what we were hearing Kimbrell say when he came into our studio, Senator Josh Kimbrell from the South Carolina upstate. However, he is one of the guys who is advocating to bring the rate down to zero, and he was one of the first people to introduce legislation to do this in the 2021 session.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, right after he got elected in 2020, he campaigned on income tax cuts, immediately came in and filed a bill that would have dramatically lowered that top marginal rate in South Carolina. You got a clip of him too, Dylan? Let's take a listen.
Let's roll it.
All forms of taxation put a burden on folks. The question is, how do you spread that burden evenly and make it less burdensome for families that are trying to work really hard and make it to where it's fair? And if you look at the states that have been the most successful, Texas, Tennessee, Florida come to mind, right? Those are the fastest growing economically, some of the fastest growing in terms of population. Certainly we are too, but those are really large states that still manage to really bring home the bacon in terms of jobs, in terms of GDP growth. They still run huge surpluses, and guess what? They do it without an income tax. And I've always looked at that model, and in 2021, I was kind of the lone guy out there introducing, let's get rid of it completely. And to his credit, Chairman Peeler worked with me and said, okay, well, look, you're not going to get a complete zeroing out of the income tax this year like you'd like, but I'll work with you if you'll work with me. And we ended up passing the biggest, to that point, income tax reduction in the history of the state. I've reintroduced that same package again this year to go to zero. I'm hoping that luck strikes twice and I at least get some other massive reduction this year. I'd like to see that happen. Those states put the burden equally on everybody. I mean, one of the things I hate are progressive income tax schemes. Mm-hmm. You should not punish success. When people do better, make more money, the federal government, state governments take a bigger piece of your productivity. That is not an incentive for more productivity, right? It's actually a disincentive, if that's the word. And then you have a lot of people who just skip out on paying altogether. In my opinion, you ought to be able to control your own destiny in terms of paying taxes.
So Kimbrell, obviously one of these folks who is talking about cutting it down to zero. And I don't think that this is just partisan campaigning, race to the bottom. Both of these guys have not formally announced that they're running for governor. However, both of them are in the room, colleagues of one another, as South Carolina is discussing this policy. So I would expect them to not be blowing smoke out of their butts, because they're now going to have to answer for what they've said here on the record during this policy debate. However, somebody who is not in that room, somebody who is campaigning on this issue, is Congresswoman Nancy Mace. Obviously, she's currently up in D.C., so she's not a part of the South Carolina State House tax fight. However, I referenced in a question to her at a recent press conference the fact that South Carolina is a legislatively dominated state, asking her if she won the position and she became our governor, how would she address that? What would she do? She obviously served in the South Carolina State House, so she understands the balance of power and how most of that power would lie in the hands of the legislature. And interestingly, she gave me about a 5-point answer, which we won't watch all of. But point one of that answer was to address taxes, and she was advocating for dropping the rate to 0. Can we watch her answer as well?
Yeah, let's take a look. Nancy Mace, here she is.
Congresswoman Mace, you talk about taking action. South Carolina is a legislatively dominated state.
Yes.
What would you see yourself doing as governor?
Understanding how the legislature works with the governor's office and even the lieutenant governor's office. And so in terms of policy, the policies that I'm looking at in a statewide potential run, number one is the taxation that we have at the state level. Our state income tax is pretty high for a Southern conservative state at 6%. Working with the legislature, understanding what makes them tick to reduce it, I think it should be 0.
Yeah, and obviously, Dylan, she's one of the front runners in this contest. Attorney General Alan Wilson, the other early front runner, he has made it clear that taxes will be a centerpiece of his candidacy as well. And then, of course, we've got all the legislative leaders, Merle Smith, Thomas Alexander, Harvey Peeler. These guys are signaling that they're going to be in support of big, bold tax cuts. And you saw Nancy Mace talking about taking it to 0. South Carolina Freedom Caucus has proposed that already. Justin Bamberg,
A Democrat.
absolutely. Has proposed taking that tax
And this is
rate.
something you've been calling for like 15 years now. I guess better late than never. It took the whole rest of the Southeast absolutely drumming us on tax rates. But, we're finally doing something.
Yeah, it is. It's been gratifying to watch a lot of these issues that we've been on for so many years starting to finally gain some credence amongst those at the State House, finally see some momentum for those as
I mean, you've been beating up these kind of uniparty rhino, as Republicans like to call them, Republican and name only type guys who I would say 100% 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, were completely in control over there at the State House. I think with this most recent set of elections, certainly we've seen the Senate's composition change. I don't know that the leadership over there is, truly red conservative, but certainly there are more real conservative members in the Senate. The House, it kind of remains for me to see what they do this session. We'll see if there's proof in the pudding. But they're arguing, look, last session they got some things done. They certainly did. And they're arguing that there's a real change of tone in the leadership over there. And I would argue that if they get, real tax cuts across this session, there's some truth to that.
Well, we're going to, again, we've always said on this show with these guys, it's no longer trust but verify, it's just verify. Because over the last few decades, there has been absolutely no substantive motion on tax reform, on spending reform. And you're right, FITSNews has been calling these guys out for years saying, hey, let people keep more of their money. That is how you grow an economy, not by giving billions of dollars away to, woke crony capitalists.
That was a major ding against the current, House leadership. They were the ones who facilitated this woke crony capitalism.
Well, they did. And again, it'd be one thing if it worked. It'd be
Right.
one thing if it was successful in raising incomes. If it would be one thing if it were
I
successful.
have no problem with the bet that the state put on the BMW plant because that has been very successful. But the bet on this EV plant, a bet on an industry which was struggling from its inception because there's really just an artificial demand for these vehicles, which is driven by federal subsidies, which if you take those away, I don't know where the demand for those vehicles lies. Obviously, there are a lot of consumers who like EVs, but at the same time, there's a lot of people who it's just not right for their lifestyle. They need to be able to travel a couple hundred miles and then instantly have more fuel and travel a couple hundred miles more. And so for our state to be, betting $1 billion plus of the money of the folks who live here on that industry as, ostensible conservatives is just laughable.
Well, not only that, less than, they hadn't even spent the money. Less than a few months later, they're now in front of the State House looking for a carve out before the legislature, looking for tens of millions in new money to train the workers to work at this facility because apparently we don't have enough smart workers to fill this gap in employment. But Dylan, again, it goes back to show us the outcomes, show us the proof that this works. And we have seen none of that. And when we look at these lawmakers campaigning year after year, claiming to be conservative, yet they're blowing money on billions of dollars worth of pork every year, non-essential government enterprises like Santee Cooper, a power company that blew $9 billion of taxpayer and ratepayer money on a nuclear plant that never finished. Thankfully, we're going to hopefully be able to start that again. But again, they're just not governing in a manner consistent with the rhetoric that they've campaigned on. And South Carolinians have been getting the short end of the stick for decades.
Yeah, and I think, this campaign season coming, we're going to hear a lot of rhetoric. We're going to see a lot of knife fighting. And once somebody finally does take the governor's office, we're going to hold them accountable to doing whatever it is that they say they're going to do on the campaign trail. But I really do appreciate these guys who are currently in the arena, currently in the policy arena, coming in and talking specifics about what they want to get done. I think that was great of both of those senators to do, and I hope we can have more lawmakers in these very chairs in the coming weeks.
Oh, yeah. Well, these mics are open, folks. So anybody running for governor, I don't know if T-Rav's going to come in and sit down. We'll see. We'll make the invitation. Maybe he'll come in and surprise us. But Dylan, the other thing, it talked about being gratified that so many candidates are talking about the issues that FITSNews has been championing for years, talking about so many of the lawmakers finally introducing legislation on some of these issues that FITSNews has been championing for years. There was also a poll released this week, South Carolina Policy Council, a respected limited government think tank in Columbia, South Carolina. They released a poll, bipartisan poll, registered voters, both parties, all over the state. And the results showed a lot of folks, again, backing the issues that we've been talking about, more than 60% favoring taking that income rate to zero, including a third strongly supporting that. Saw consistent support for school choice, for judicial reform, another issue we've been banging the drum on. So again, not only gratifying to see the leaders finally taking some motion on it, but to see that sort of seep into the public domain, because again, these guys have been getting fed a steady stream of far left propaganda from the state, from the Post and Courier. I mean, these guys have been shoving that stuff down their throats. So it's gratifying to see the people kind of recognizing, hey, wait a minute, maybe that EV plant's not such a good deal. Maybe that pork barrel spending isn't paying any dividends to me, because these politicians, again, Dylan, they've been lying to these folks for so many years.
Yeah, and I think that that's why it's really important for alternative media outlets like this one to exist.
Yep. And why the open mic's important too, because again, we're
not right on everything.
Yeah.
No, we totally acknowledge that. We're human beings. We're fallible. Our opinions are not always right. But that's why we have discussions. That's why we have multiple people voice multiple perspectives, so that we can hopefully, when we all come together, get to something approximating the truth.
I want to ask you about covering this upcoming race, because you've been emerging. By the way, nice haircut. For those of you who haven't been following Dylan Nolan, the ladies at my house were just crestfallen.
Oh my!
They love Dylan's long hair. A little April was almost in tears, Dylan.
It's been polarizing. I've gotten a lot of compliments. I've gotten a lot of people say, "Why did you do it?"
I know. Now Andy Fancher thinking about cutting his hair too, man.
We'll see.
Anyway, it's just a tragedy.
Somebody had to have some hair in this office.
Exactly. It ain't gonna be me, man. But I want to talk to you. You've been covering these races, these candidates. You've been covering the legislative process. Been covering national issues for us as well. This race that's shaping up the governor's race here in South Carolina clearly has national implications. Clearly is going to feed into the 2028 presidential contest. How is covering this race seems like it's going to be impossible, because you've got Ravenel coming in, you've got Sanford coming in, you've got Mace throwing bombs every 5 seconds. How hard is it going to be to bring people, like we've been talking about, these issues that matter to their daily lives? How's it going to, I mean, how are we going to do this, man? It's going to be an insanity.
I think that, we have to, of course, cover the bomb throwing. It is news. It's newsworthy. Whether the throwers of the bombs and the recipients of the explosions like it or not, that is news. But at the same time, like Nancy, who was throwing bombs 30 seconds before I asked her that question at the press conference, gave me a long and substantive answer. So I think the key is to actually ask substantive questions. You can get her, why do you think Alan Wilson's a piece of crap who shouldn't run? And she'll go. She'll run on that like crazy. But at the same time, clearly she had an answer prepared for if somebody asked her substantively, what would you do when you're the governor? So I think getting these people in the studio, asking them substantive questions, and yes, we're going to have a good time covering the mud fest, the pigs getting down there in the mud and rolling around, the knifing of one another, the blood going everywhere, the political blood being spilled. When you're a news outlet, that's great. But when we're trying to provide substantive reporting for the people of South Carolina, hoping to pick somebody who's going to be a champion of policy that's good for them, I think the key is to ask these candidates questions about substantive issues and to pay attention to their answers.
Well, and also very interesting, I'd kind of throw T-Rev under the bus there as the reality star jumping in the race, but he kind of jumped in with a very substantive declaration of where the executive branch is failing and what he would specifically do differently. So pretty substantive opening for Ravenel.
I'd love to see Ravenel in the studio.
Again, We'll see if that happens. He and Mark Sanford, there may be a little too much water under the bridge for those two guys to come here. I've been a little bit mean to those guys, man. Little critical.
Well, you and everybody else.
Yeah.
I would love to see some new polling, reflecting all of these people who have entered the race or dipped their toe in, because what we've seen, obviously showed Alan and Nancy as the two serious contenders. But I would be interesting if you throw a Bravo star and a former governor in there. What does it look like?
Well, and that's interesting. When Ravenel ran in 2014 against Lindsey Graham, again, there was a ton of momentum against Lindsey Graham then, just as there is now. Ravenel was actually in a pretty good position early in that race to potentially pose a credible threat to Lindsey Graham down the road. His candidacy kind of fell apart, though. He ended up under 4%, just never panned out, but he was polling in the mid-teens.
And by the way, I think it's very interesting you talk about this. We keep talking about all these people jumping into the gubernatorial race. Lindsey Graham is one of the most hated politicians in America. You see him getting booed at Trump rallies, ostensibly people who should be supporting him, when he was invited to be there, in his home region of the state.
Yeah, it's
I mean, it
amazing.
doesn't get much worse than that. But the reality is, Lindsey has Scrooge McDuck level troves of money. And so I think that these folks who are not maybe that serious about actually running a race here, who don't have access to $100 million, but who might want to get their name in some headlines, aren't going to mess around with that.
Yeah, that Ukraine arms business is pretty good, and all those guys donating to Lindsey Graham, they made a lot of money over there in Ukraine, dropping bombs. I'm sure that's where a lot of his money comes from. That neocon movement that is backing him, that backs Nikki Haley. Those guys are thick as thieves when it comes to these politicians that constantly champion interventionism.
You're
Again,
going to need to have some serious money to fight that machine.
you are going to need to have some serious money. It is interesting. We talk about Lindsey Graham and his potential vulnerability. We've mentioned Andre Bauer, the former lieutenant governor, as a possible candidate. Bauer has confirmed he's thinking about it. Adam Morgan, the former Freedom Caucus chairman, his name was thrown out just this past week, several media reports. Now, Morgan went on social media and said, hey, I haven't said anything about this,
Right.
but didn't deny it either. So
Maybe we should get Adam in the studio.
we'll get him in here, absolutely, because that race almost more important if you think about the direction of this country. You think about,
Right.
that's a critical race. However, Graham, I think very smartly, made it clear that even Trump's controversial nominees, President Donald Trump's controversial nominees, he's going to back them. I think he saw the writing on the wall when it came to those appointments. We're talking about Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Tulsi Gabbard. We're talking about
He might be a snake, but he's not stupid.
not a stupid snake. Correct. And he knows how to count to 6, as he always said. 4 years, I'm going to do what I want. The last 2 years, I'll go running back to the base. He has done that ever since he got elected back in 2002. So
Maybe somebody will make him pay for it, but honestly, Lindsey has proven to be such an effective politician that until that person emerges and starts gaining steam, I'm not going to hold my breath.
yeah, and like you said, whoever does want to make him pay is going to have to pay up, because the cost of entry in that race, astronomical. Dylan, so much fun stuff to cover on this thing. What a state, man. What a place to cover politics. You got any predictions as we head into the meat of this legislative session? You followed a key judge race over there at the State House.
Yes, it was interesting. This is the race that we had referenced before, the upstate judge, Melissa Inzerillo, who was running. I encourage folks to reach out, and credit to our audience. I had multiple people reach out. Prosecutor Lisa Collins went on the record in defense of Inzerillo as a professional, as a jurist. We ran that. We ran quotes from folks who wanted her to be on the bench, folks from quotes who didn't want her to be on the bench. Ultimately, the General Assembly voted to not give her that York County judgeship. That seat will now sit unfilled until they can have another election. Feel about that however you may, depending on which side of the aisle you fall on. I think it was important that this wasn't done in the back room, kind of without anybody knowing what was going on outside of a select handful of people. So I was very proud to have that reporting. Let
You
folks
pissed
know
off
what was going
everybody
on.
on that. Everybody was pissed off at you.
Yeah,
on this
I
one.
did honestly piss off both sides, which I
You're
think,
doing a good job.
when you're doing this job, if you're afraid to aggravate some people, you should probably find a new job.
No, that's right. Well, Dylan, amazing work this past week on all these political stories. We're going to be keeping track of these moving forward. Also, I want to throw this out to those of you. If you are thinking about running, if you don't want to sit down with me, this is another guy. Sit down and do the interview. So, you got multiple choices here. These guys here in the studio, they'll tell you, I don't hold y'all back.
No, yeah. If it's true, if it's not defamatory, you're going to let us publish it, and that's why I like working for you.
Absolutely. Whether, hey, my history notwithstanding. So any of those candidates with a little history with me, you want to sit down with Dylan, he'll cover the interview and we'll take it where it goes. But T-Rav, Governor Sanford, you're more than welcome on this set. Our open mic available to anybody. Dylan, excellent work. We're going to follow this crazy circus as it continues moving on down the road.
And we're going to keep having fun doing it. Thank you, Will.
All right, folks, that is a wrap for this week's show. I want to thank Dylan, Nolan, Jen Wood, our whole team. Before we go, some news on a number of stories we've been covering extensively over the past few months, including the Alec Murdaugh case. Russell Laffitte, one of the key co-conspirators in this saga, he is headed back to federal court after his convictions were overturned last year by a U.S. appellate court. Now, Laffitte is asking for a statewide jury in his retrial as opposed to a low-country jury, believing that he has been unfairly castigated by certain media outlets in the South Carolina low country. Our Jen Wood has a big story on that on FITSNews.com. Also, our Andy Fancher unearthed a big exclusive in the upstate. Spartanburg County Sheriff Chuck Wright under criminal investigation. Andy's got that report also on FITSNews.com. He's busting badges gone bad left and right, people. And also an update on a case that folks have been following all across the country, Michael Colucci. A retrial has been scheduled in that case for June 16, 2025. News of that broke exclusively on FITSNews earlier this week. Colucci, of course, accused of killing his wife back in 2015. Original trial ended in a mistrial. He was scheduled to be retried last year, but that was delayed. He will go to trial this spring. Obviously, FITSNews will be there. And last but not least, if you haven't caught up with the latest in the Micah Miller saga, our Cali Lions, Jen Wood, and I have posted numerous stories on FITSNews this week relating to the very latest developments in that case, both in the court and outside of the court, as John Paul Miller's world continues to collapse around him in the aftermath of his wife's suspicious suicide last spring. This kind of coverage, folks, this independent coverage, it's the type you won't find anywhere else. That's why we do what we do, to hold folks accountable, to bring you the truth of all these stories, to bring you all sides of these stories. If you want to support us in those efforts, support that kind of journalism, please consider subscribing to FITSNews.com. It's only $8 a month, and your subscription helps empower all that we do here. Thanks again for tuning in, and we will check you next time on The Week in Review.